and Panzer IIs. These were employed primarily in the role of infantry support and involved in fighting French and British troops. Although the French had deployed a number of Renault light tanks, there was no tank-to-tank combat in this theatre. The Panzer XXXVIIIs were returned to Germany even before the end of the Norwegian campaign, in time for service in France. Shortly before sunrise on the morning of the 10th of May 1940, every combat aircraft available to the Luftwaffe in the west took off and headed towards airfields and targets in Holland, Belgium and France. Surprise was total, as 300 aircraft were destroyed on the ground. But the air assault, the overture to Germany's long-expected offensive in the west, was so weighted it suggested its primary effort was directed at Holland and northern Belgium. Subsequently, the Allied High Command was to assume, as the Germans intended them to, that Hitler would launch his forces into northern Belgium, brushing aside the Dutch border and driving south into northern France in a 1940s replay of the Schlieffen Plan.
Das Ziel im Raum von Dünkirchen ist erreicht.
After the bombers came the lumbering Junkers 52 transports, disgorging large numbers of paratroopers into Holland. Other special operations units were dropped by glider on defensive fortifications in Belgium. To Allied intelligence officers, this massive effort by the Germans just confirmed their assumptions. They received further reinforcements a few hours later, when German ground forces belonging to Army Group B under von Bock, deploying 3 Panzer divisions and 23 infantry divisions, crossed the border into Belgium and Holland. In the face of this German assault, the Dutch and Belgian armies chose to retreat and await the arrival of the Allied forces. The German 18th Army pushed into Holland, while to the south 6th Army advanced into northern Belgium. Little did the Allies suspect that this was all a great feint to draw them into Belgium. The trap had been sprung. On the following morning, the Allies obliged the Germans by advancing all their forces in northern France into Belgium to occupy the line of the River Dyle. The French strategy was purely passive, having consciously rejected any sort of attack. They would receive the Germans in Belgium and block their advance into northern France. The roads northward became choked with advancing French and British units and military equipment. General Bernard Montgomery, commanding 3rd Division, was to comment that the whole move had gone like clockwork. The forces the Allies were bringing into Belgium were enough to break the German flood, which they expected to wash down from northern Belgium. In their blind conviction that no other invasion route was available to the Germans, they'd ruled out the Ardennes. The accepted and unchallenged wisdom was that the forest was impassable to armoured vehicles, so no threat was considered from that sector.
We're going to hang out watching on the Siegfried line, 'cause the watching day is here. Weather, the weather,
For Hitler in his forward headquarters, news of the Allied movement into Belgium was one of the crowning moments of his life. He was later to recall that, when the news came that the enemy was advancing along the whole front, I could have wept for joy. They'd fallen right into my trap. Although not the originator of German operations, Hitler's endorsement of von Manstein's proposal to shift maximum effort from Belgium southwards to the Ardennes was what tilted the argument over the Western strategy. Even as he pored over his maps with Jodl and Keitel, his panzers were driving through the Ardennes forest towards the Meuse. Here lay the true centre of gravity of the German offensive. Under General von Rundstedt, 7 panzer divisions were thrusting for the line of the River Meuse. Having secured crossing points, they were to drive full tilt for the Channel coast. thereby cutting off the Allied forces in Belgium from France. This then was Sichelschnitt, the cut of the side that would spell the defeat of the Allies in the west. Emerging from the Ardennes, the German armour merely brushed aside the token French forces that stood in their way and thrust forward toward the river. The Panzer 38Ts of Rommel's 7th Panzer Division reached the Meuse at Dinant on the 13th of May, while to the south Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps had thrust through to the river near Sedan. The whole German enterprise turned on the fortunes of her panzers, and yet closer examination of the 2,574 tanks she'd amassed for the invasion of France would reveal that 1,478 of them were already obsolescent Panzers I and II, with a further 334 being Czech Panzer 35Ts and 38Ts. Only 627 Panzer IIIs and IVs were on a par with the French Saumur S-35 or the Char 1B bis. Thus, tank for tank, the Germans were fielding mainly inferior machines, nor could they compensate with superior numbers. Anglo-French tank numbers exceeded those of the Germans. What mattered here, and was the key to the success in this campaign, was technique. Behind a screen of Stuka dive bombers that plummeted on the opposition and were as much a part of the equation as the tanks, Guderian bridged the river. Rommel too was over. Both generals now took as much armour across to the other side as they could manage. Tanks were rafted over, some managed to ford the river, but the build-up continued. On the 14th and 15th, Guderian had to remonstrate over a halt order from Kleist. His troops sat idly by as he argued the case for being allowed to continue with the advance without having to wait for the infantry to catch up with him. He was concerned that the advantage the Germans had achieved was being thrown away by timidity. On the 16th of May, Guderian was permitted to resume his advance, only to be halted on the 17th. It would seem that no footage was taken of Panzer 35Ts in the French campaign. Indeed, only 143 were actually employed in it. These, serving with the 6th Panzer Division, crossed the Meuse at Montherm on the 15th of May and formed part of Hoth's 15th Panzer Corps. Ranging ahead of the panzers and providing direct support for them were the Stuka dive bombers, plunging down on any target that could halt the German armoured columns. Their near-vertical descent with sirens wailing like banshees had a profound impact, and the psychological effect of the Stuka was every bit as great as the high explosive it dropped on its target. Their contribution to the German victory, acting in tandem with the panzers, was crucial. This Panzer 38T was one of 288 utilised in the offensive. They were employed by the 7th and